Good evening. I'm Kelly Wright. Thanks for joining me as we spend this next hour together. As always, I do sincerely hope that you're safe and well, taking care of yourself and your family, because you do matter. Opening observations tonight. Congress. It would seem that Congress needs some CPR. No, I don't mean cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which some critics do say Congress is in need of a heart to care more about the American people. No, I mean CPR in terms of Congress performing responsibly. Case in point, Dr. Anthony Fauci, CDC Director Robert Redfield, and the Deputy Director of Health and Human Services, all three of these men gathered today to testify before the House Select Committee on the coronavirus crisis. So you would think that the members of Congress would try to get down to the bottom of what's happening with our coronavirus task force from the White House and to get on a national plan that's firm and clear with clarity so that we can deal with this virus that has now caused more than 152,000 deaths of Americans, as well as more than 4 million cases in this country. No, instead, we saw the blame game going on. Here's my point. Congressman Mark Green, the Republican of Tennessee, claims Committee Chairman James Clyburn is trying to blame the Republican governors of states where the rise of COVID cases is increasing. And then there's Republican Jim Jordan, the Congressman of Ohio, focusing on Black Lives Matter protests, pressing Dr. Anthony Fauci on the protests being responsible for the transmission of the virus. Dr. Fauci pointed out that there's a lack of unity in state responses, and that is hurting the effort to contain the coronavirus. And then there's Democrat Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland raising the question about why other countries are succeeding in containing the virus while the United States continues to see it escalate. We have a problem. The problem is that we need Congress to exercise sound judgment and stop playing games. The blame game has to stop. We, the people, need our members of Congress and the White House to get on a firm foundation. As James Brown used to say, get on the good foot. And as John Lewis would say, start some good trouble in stopping the spread of the coronavirus. It's got to stop. And those are my opening observations. Well, during all of this taking place on Capitol Hill, as the American people watch, Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina, who is the majority whip and also the chair of the committee, he became very clear in his defense of those who are protesting on the streets. Here's what he had to say.
We open up this meeting today, and many of you, Dr. Redfield most especially, and you, Mr. Ranking Member, talking about our great friend John Lewis, with whom I enjoyed a 60-year relationship. We met protesting, trying to get off the back of the bus, trying to integrate schools, trying to be able to shop in a 5 and 10 cent store and not be arrested for trespassing. Fine for us to get school supplies out of that store, but you can't sit down and eat a hamburger. I'm glad the government did not limit our protests.
Congressman James Clyburn, the majority whip of the House. Now, yesterday I talked to Congressman Bobby Scott, who is the chair of the House Education and Labor Committee. And he's very concerned about what's going on with regard to the economy. He's also quite concerned about what's happening on the Senate side, where it seems that Senate Republicans cannot come to an agreement amongst themselves about what to do in terms of providing a stimulus package that will meet the needs of the American people. Here now is that excerpt from my interview with Congressman Bobby Scott.
Well, first of all, it's not a stalemate between the Democrats and the Republicans.
Right.
The present stalemate is between the Republicans and the Republicans. The Democrats have passed a bill I believe it's a very comprehensive bill addressing all of the concerns well, most of the concerns. You can't address everything. Most of the concerns we have. The normal legislative process would be for the Senate to pass a bill, and then you go into a conference committee to reconcile the differences. The Senate hasn't passed a bill. In fact, there's no indication that the Senate has even 51 votes, not the 60 you need to break a filibuster. They don't even have 51 votes to do whatever they want to do. It could be they've got a handful of senators that don't want to do anything, and a handful of senators that want to do more closely aligned with what the House wants to do. And some haven't said much. I mean, they haven't come together with a position. But the two major points of controversy right now, the $600 extra on unemployment compensation for the median worker. That means they're getting today about what they were getting before all the layoffs. And you have to put these layoffs in context. The original claims for unemployment compensation when people lose their jobs, the record before this pandemic, the record for 1 week was 600 and some thousand. We've had 3 months where the number went from 1 million and some to 4 million and 5 million. That's why the unemployment compensation, the employment commissions have had so much trouble keeping up with it. The numbers of people coming in are so high. Now, part of this is because self-inflicted. We've told people to stay home. We've
Right.
told businesses to shut down. And as they have cooperated, it's only appropriate that we try to reduce the damage done to the economy and the damage done to them personally, but doing what is best for the community. And so we wanted to make them whole, and the $600 made the median person whole. Now, some people actually make a little more than they were before, but a lot of people couldn't afford housing before. I mean, you're supposed to pay 25% of your salary for housing. Now, a lot of people are paying 50% and more for housing. And the $600 makes it possible for people to get through the pandemic. And when we get on the other side, then we can deal with the problems we have.
My thanks to Congressman Bobby Scott for talking yesterday about not only the economy, but also about his good friend, the late, great Congressman John Lewis. When we return, we'll be talking to Dr. Yolanda Hancock about COVID-19. That's next. Welcome back. So with all that's going on with Congress and the Select Committee on the coronavirus situation, we find that politics is being played and some information is going out where Dr. Anthony Fauci and the others who are on the panel with them, Dr. Redfield and the Admiral from HHS, of course, Dr. Redfield being the director of the CDC, they've all had to respond in kind about what's actually happening with the science. But joining me now to drill down on the science is public health expert and pediatrician, Dr. Yolanda Hancock. Doctor, thanks for joining us today. And you've seen some updates from today's committee hearing. And I tell you, I was shaking my head as I saw so many arguments that didn't need to be made, because the bottom line is we have a COVID-19 pandemic and it's hurting our country and costing us lives. What do you think about what happened today on Capitol Hill?
For me, as I watched portions of it in between seeing patients, it became very frustrating because the line of questioning, in some regards, had little to do with our response and creating a strong nationwide concerted effort. And instead, it was more of a defense about what we have done and questions about suggested treatment modalities, really in defense of the president and his positioning. And it certainly divides along party lines in terms of how the questions are being asked. My expectation of this update of this hearing was really to get a sense of what are we doing now? Where are we now? What are we doing now? And what do we need to do? What resources need to be put in place so that when we enter into whatever this second wave is, or just a peaking of this current wave, what do we do to protect the American populace? And as much as I appreciate and respect Dr. Fauci, and in some regards, Dr. Redfield, which we'll talk about in a little bit, it becomes difficult, I can imagine, for them to be put on the spot and being asked questions about allowing protest and those sorts of things. They're not there to make those judgments, just to provide the evidence.
I found that very disturbing and disconcerting, if you will, because when Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, the Republican from Ohio, started asking questions about Black Lives Matter and protests, it seemed that he had some amnesia about the fact that there were other protesters before Black Lives Matter who were armed with weapons and not wearing masks at all. Now, Doc, I know on good authority that you've been to some of the protests, as well as I have been to some of those protests, and I saw whites and blacks masked up at those peaceful protests of Black Lives Matter. And clearly we could see that other protesters before that who were protesting to get their jobs back and demanding it from their governors were armed and ready and unmasked. I just don't understand why we're taking time out to talk about politics at a time when people really need to understand the science.
Right, but I mean, that's been the case since the start of the pandemic. It's been a politicized issue instead of a basic public health issue, and that's where we've gone wrong. Decisions about closing states down, reopening states, have not been driven based on science, data, or expert opinion, and really being driven by your political positioning. Studies have shown, or evidence has shown, that peak cases have not been associated with Black Lives Matters protests. As you mentioned, the majority of Black Lives Matters protesters have been masked. I was just at a rally and spoke at a rally this past Friday, and we were all masked up. The only time anyone was allowed to take their mask off was when they were stepping up to the mic. And they have looked at the data. Experts have looked at the data because we were concerned that this would be an argument, and there has been no data demonstrating peaks in any of the states where protests have happened. Now, back when they were protesting about their haircuts and their nails getting done, no one was arms about that. And to your point, no one had on a mask. What we are seeing, studies have recently revealed, at least in my county, here in Prince George's County, that the majority of spread has been in family gatherings and in these house parties that people have decided to have, these barbecues and other community-related gatherings. So it hasn't been linked to protest. And we here in Prince George's County have been all about protesting, but when they've looked at contact tracing to determine the risk of spread, it has been from communal spread, not from protest. And again, this is just an attempt to politicize the issue, to incorporate the attack on Black lives and our ability to use our voice when that attack did not happen, when people were protesting about haircuts.
It's actually crazy when I think about it and actually see it. I was sitting there with disbelief, and yet I understand the politics. This is an election year, and I just found it very difficult to watch that without getting some sense of, well, where do we start really making sense of the science that you've talked about, that other doctors have talked about. And I'd like you to stay with me, because on the other side of the break, let's drill down on the actual science of what's happening with COVID-19 and where we stand right now, because there are 152,000 people who have died from this, and we're expecting and anticipating many more. Talking to Dr. Yolanda Hancock when we return from the break after this. Welcome back to the program. So I've been talking to Dr. Yolanda Hancock, who is a public health expert. She's with the Milken Institute of Public Health at the George Washington University, as well as a pediatrician. And Doc, we were talking about the fact that politics was ruling the day once more as it pertains to how we treat and how we mitigate this coronavirus. And yet, I keep finding, as you stated, that Dr. Anthony Fauci is always under the gun, if you will, under a lot of scrutiny from many Republicans and the president, because they don't like the science. The science is real. We have a real case of coronavirus in this country. And how long can we continue to blame Dr. Fauci for not getting it right when our federal government itself has not been able to get it right with clarity and coming out of the starting gate to deal with this virus head on as other countries have?
Absolutely. I mean, everything about this pandemic has been politicized, from the wearing of a mask to treatment, right? So hydrochloroquine has shown itself back up as a potential game changer again in terms of treatment, where Dr. Fauci was questioned about his stance on hydrochloroquine not being an effective treatment modality for COVID-19. And one study was picked out, the study coming out of the Henry Ford Center, where he specified that the study is flawed. You can't do a case control retrospective study and make a claim about treatment, especially with an unknown like COVID-19. All randomized control trials have not shown hydrochloroquine to be effective. At worst case scenario, it's actually shown to be to increase mortality for COVID-19 patients. The gold standard studies for treatment, for efficacy, for all of those are randomized, double-blinded control studies. That's where we can make very conclusive decisions about what we use in the clinical space. To use something where people are not blinded, where we could not control the environment, you do not make clinical decisions based on that sort of data, especially when our gold standard data reflects something different. But because the president and Republicans have aligned themselves to hydrochloroquine for who knows what reason, then it also makes this drug political, where now even some doctors who have questionable backgrounds are put out on releasing their own press releases on YouTube with viral videos talking about their use of hydrochloroquine. Again, unless you are doing a randomized double-blinded control study where your article has now undergone peer review and those results are recurrent in other settings, you can't speak to the efficacy of hydrochloroquine. We can only base our clinical decisions on evidence-based practice. And that's what Dr. Fauci stands for. Unfortunately, a lot of politicians don't subscribe to it, and the American populace does not necessarily have the skill set, because we don't teach these critical analysis skills, especially when it comes to science. A lot of this stuff was done behind the scenes. Because of this pandemic, people are now more aware of how we approach science and how we approach treating our patients.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of trust that has to be earned as we continue to find that the vaccine could be probable in 2021. Is that correct? It could come as early as January?
Absolutely. So there are two companies now, Moderna and Pfizer, Moderna is already in phase 3 studies, which after phase 3, you take a product to market, and Pfizer will start phase 3 studies starting next month in August. And so what we will see is a vaccine that will likely be available. But until we address the trust issues, we are already, as a pediatrician, trust with parents in terms of vaccines is something I have to deal with every single day. And these are vaccines that have been around since before my time. So the creation of a new vaccine with a perceived rush to market is going to cause even more fear and trepidation in terms of it being used. And that's something that's real and has to be addressed, especially when there are concerns about how transient antibodies are and the immune response is for COVID-19. Recent studies have demonstrated that immunity to COVID-19 actually decreases in terms of circulating immune cells. We have our memory cells in place, but in terms of the robust response, how robust will the response be with the current vaccine schedule of 2 vaccines spread by 1 month? Will it require more booster shots to continue to maintain the immunity? What will that look like? We won't know that until time passes.
Very good. I want to hold you for one more segment because I've got to talk about children. You're a pediatrician, and I'd like to talk to you about that on the other side of the break. We'll be back with more of Dr. Yolanda Hancock right after this. And we're back once again with Dr. Yolanda Hancock, pediatrician, and of course, public health expert who serves with the Milken Institute on Public Health at George Washington University here in the DC area. I've got to ask you about children. You are a pediatrician. You deal with children. You've had children who have come to you with COVID cases. The president talking about that children are immune to this. Does it not send out the wrong message?
Absolutely. What you do not do is put children at risk because of a political agenda about returning children to school. When you look at statistics, are children likely to die from COVID? No, compared to older adults. However, two things we have to keep in mind. One, there's something called the multi-system inflammatory syndrome that we're seeing happen more and more in our pediatric population. That's where children's hearts are at risk for coronary artery disease and rupture of their blood vessels because of this disease process. Colleagues of mine who work in the hospitals are seeing these cases more and more. But we also have to think about are the adults that these children come into contact with. Almost a third of teachers are over the age of 50. So when we talk about public health being impaired by children not going to school and not having access to mental health services, you have to balance that with the risk of their health and the risk of the health of the bus drivers, the teachers, the administrators, the custodians in those school systems, because they are also at risk. Unless the country is putting resources in place in each state to protect children, teachers, and create a system based on public health and evidence, you can't, I wouldn't risk, I'm not risking putting my daughter in school unless I knew for sure that they had everything in place to protect her and her teachers and her classmates.
Yeah, and that's coming from you, a doctor trained in treating children because of your pediatrics background and also your public health background. Yet Republican Congressman Steve Scalise stated that the schools do need to reopen, if nothing more than to protect children from child abuse and to give children something structured to do, which is going back to school. Look, we all realize that school is important, but we should do it safely as best as we can, right?
Absolutely. I want to be able to have my daughter go back to school. Teachers want to go back into the classroom. And as a pediatrician, I'm fully aware of the risk that that children are posed with in terms of abuse, mental health issues, food access, because a majority of our children, the only time they get regular meals is in the school setting. We create disparities when we do this distance learning. I can afford to put my daughter in an educational pod. Communities in Southeast and parents all across the country don't have those resources and may not even have the connectedness to do it. However, you don't rush to put children back in school without the proper provisions. You make sure that you can guarantee 6 feet of distance, making sure that you have policies in place in terms of masks. The American Academy of Pediatrics laid out a very clear plan for us to be able to return our children safely to school, but states are choosing to ignore it. If you ignore the safety measures, if you ignore the experts, then you are rolling the dice. You're playing Russian roulette, not just with children's lives, but with their families' lives and the lives of the teachers and their family members as well.
It just seems that we have so much work ahead of us and we have so much of a heavy lift to get this virus off of our backs and to flatten the curve. And I just don't know if we have to get the political will and the medical will to do the right thing.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it may be a rise in numbers and deaths for people to be convinced to act accordingly. Just recognizing that Herman Cain lost his life to COVID-19 as a result of participating in the current president's rally. That speaks volumes. This isn't a conspiracy that Republicans are dying from COVID-19. Republicans, independents, Democrats, everybody is dying as a result of COVID-19. And it isn't until we remove the political issues around COVID-19 and really focus on the public health issues, as we should with everything in this country, we will continue to move in the wrong direction. It requires resources, but it mostly requires the political will to change how we are responding.
Yeah, well said, Doc. And I, for one, I knew Herman Cain personally and had the occasion to interview him numerous times and talked to him quite a bit. And I was sorry to hear that he lost his life to COVID-19. And of course, we don't know if it happened there at the rally, but the fact of the matter is he did contract it. And
Right.
at 74 years of age, he still had so much to offer. And it's just sad that we have so many cases like that, more than 152,000 cases of people coming down with COVID, particularly those in the Black and Brown and Native American communities. We have so much work ahead of us. Doc, thanks for joining us. Please always come back and keep us informed on how we can get through this to flatten this curve.
My pleasure.
All right. Dr. Yolanda Hancock with me. We'll be back with more after this. Welcome back to the program. Joining me now is civil rights attorney Mark Harris. He is also an economist and teaches economics there at the University of California, Merced. And Mark, right now, it's all about so many things, but coronavirus continues to disrupt our economy so
Yes.
much so that we have seen it plunge to a deficit like never before. And Congress is trying to figure out what to do about it. The Federal Reserve is trying to figure out what to do about it. What do we, the American people, do in adjusting to this painful reality that our economy has plunged?
You know, I listened. First of all, Kelly, thank you again for having me on your show, having a chance to speak to your viewers. I was watching one of the morning sports shows. You know, America's celebrating the reopening of sports venues throughout the country and sports activities. I, as a fan of sports, am happy to see that as well. But there's a young man who's a receiver with the Philadelphia Eagles who said he's not coming back. He's opting out. And he was very articulate in explaining why, Kelly. Very poignant what he said about being a father and caring about his family. But one of the things he said that your viewers should really focus on, he said, I can afford to do this because I've been careful with my money. That's the biggest message I would probably give your viewers right now and everyone throughout America. It's really time to be careful with your money, maybe unlike any time in American history.
Well, when you say that, though, let's talk about just the reaction to the decline in the economy. Yesterday's numbers were staggering.
Yes.
In terms of seeing how we have been plunged into the R word, what many people are saying is a recession.
Yes, we are in a recession. A recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of diminished production within an economy. GDP, gross domestic product, which is one of the ways that you determine whether or not you're in a recession, is determined by combining all of the goods and services that are produced in a country's economy for a given period of time, typically a quarter or a year. Our GDP numbers are catastrophically off. We're 32.9% off this quarter. Just this quarter, we're 33% off of GDP. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were 5% off. So the last quarter, we were 5. This quarter, we're 33. That's almost a combined 40% reduction in gross domestic product for the United States. These are unprecedented numbers.
So, Mark, in this dreaded economy that we're dealing with right now, some people will be without that $600 a week. And of course, if it's cut, as you've just stated, it's going to be very difficult for them to continue to make ends meet. What do they do when money is not circulating in their households? How do they make it?
I think, you know, the bottom line is I don't have a cure. I don't have a silver bullet, a crystal ball for that situation, Kelly. I would be remiss if I tried to pretend that I did. None of us do. The so-called experts don't have it. But what we can do is learn how to deal with the present and the future from the past. And by that, I mean, you reduce your debt profile as much as you can. Well, that's hard, Professor Harris, because in these tough times, I'm living off of debt. I'm living off of my credit cards. I'm living off of small loans. I would really suggest that people think once, twice, 3 times. I have friends and colleagues in small business who took some of those small business loans, even though they didn't need them. They took them because they could get them. I don't think that's smart. taking on another $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 worth of debt right now, there's no such thing as free money. So what you're doing is, in my opinion, you're making a bad situation potentially worse. So what I would say to your viewers is to be vigilant, to be cautious, to be frugal. And like I said before, just like the old folks used to say, deploy some of the things that your grandparents used to deploy or your great grandparents deployed in dealing with tough economic times. Make sure that you take care of your needs before you take care of your wants. Your necessities, of course, you have to deal with. Your wants can be postponed to a better economic time.
Mark, thank you. How do you see Congress or the Fed getting us out of this quagmire with our economy because of the COVID-19 and the lack of our response to mitigate the curve of this virus? And now we're embroiled in it. Like, as I said before, more than 150,000 deaths, and certainly millions of people without work because of this. And the fact that we reopened too soon. And yes, we do have to get back to work. Eventually, we do have to get back to school, but we have to do it safely. And the essential workers are so important to us on the front lines. But those people who are without jobs, it's going to be tough.
You know, one of the things you just asked about is what the Fed can do and what the United States Treasury can do. The Fed is doing what it can. There is monetary policy that the Fed sets and fiscal policy that the Congress and the president set. We're in a mess on the fiscal policy side. All of the debate back and forth and the fact that the administration can't agree with the Congress can't agree with itself. That's fiscal policy that is being worked out slowly. As they say, you know, making policy is like making sausage. It's not very pretty. That's where they are in Washington right now. But you also talked about the Fed, and the Fed is doing what it can through a process called quantitative easing. And that is, it's artificially suppressing interest rates right now to keep the whole economy from seizing up. We saw this in 2008. We're seeing it now. The Fed is doing, in my opinion, about as much as it can, Kelly. It's now incumbent upon the president and the Congress to come up with a sound fiscal policy that will help assist us as we move through this process.
Mark Harris, thank you for weighing in on this. Very important to hear from you about how we move forward economically and what we can do right now in the here and now, dealing with these tough economic times because of COVID-19. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Always appreciate you, Kelly. Thank you.
All right. We'll be back with more after this. Welcome back to the program. So we do have time to talk about strengthening the family. It's always important to keep our families strong, make them stronger and better so that we can deal with what's going on in this new normal that I've often said is quite abnormal. So joining me now is George and Tonda Gregory of Journey for Life, as well as NFL chaplains to the Los Angeles Chargers. Good of you to join us today. You know, on Wednesday, we talked about navigating through this season of uncertainty. And so I'd like for us to continue on that today so we can actually drill down on specifically what we can do in these uncertain times to make certain that our families are stronger and not weakened by the economy, by COVID-19, by racial issues, and all the tensions that are flooding our households.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. And uncertain seasons are inevitable in life because that's what life is about, is you can have a plan, but it doesn't mean that it's going to play out the way you intended it. And you've got to be ready for when it throws you a curveball, right? And so in order to be ready, we got to have the right mindset. We got to have a resilient mindset, which I call mental toughness, right? The ability to know that we can get through this. Like we can bounce back whatever's thrown at us. We can prepare on the fly to make those adjustments necessary for us to succeed. One of our favorite movies is called The Gladiator. And Maximus is in the arena with the gladiators and they have to fight all these villains. And right before the gate opens, it says, whatever comes through these gates, we have a better chance of survival if we stick together. do you understand? If we stick together, we can survive. So having that right mental strength or that mental toughness, and knowing that if you and your family can stick together, you can survive and you can overcome whatever is thrown at you for today, for that day. You just have to have that mindset that we're going to find new ways to forgive each other. We're going to find new ways to give grace to each other. We're going to find new ways to operate together as a family. And so just that encouragement is going to be key to getting through.
Yeah, I think that point is, it's almost like every day as believers, what we pray for is God's brand new mercy. So we're looking for something to receive from God. And yet there's some things that we should be looking to give because we have received from God. So when we give mercy to our spouse or our kids, then we're also going to receive mercy. And so another big point is that we've got to have the right preparation, right? And of course, as NFL chaplains, most days it's all about the practice, right? In fact, they say a lot of times that practice makes perfect. But we have to prepare for seasons of uncertainty. And that means that we've got to go through every day as if the storm is upon us. Now, we don't have to wince as if the storm is upon us, but how we practice is really how we're going to play, right? And so Coach Lynn often says this, practice like you're going to play the game. But then when we get in the game, he says that if that route that you're running is not working, we got to do something different. And he calls that situational awareness. And so there's sometimes that you wake up that as a family or maybe as a married couple or a business leader, you think it's the same play and you can run it, but yet that day you might have to have a little bit more situational awareness. So we look at things like Mr. Miyagi, another movie, right? Mr. Miyagi with Karate Kid. The Karate Kid was ready to fight Kelly, but Mr. Miyagi just told him, hey, today we're going to prepare like you're fighting. He says, wax on, wax off. And so many times we're ready to get in the game, and yet that toughness that Tandra talked about, plus that preparation, will help us to be ready for the day's challenges.
You know, I like everything that both of you have just said, especially that part about Maximus there in the Gladiator, as a gladiator, and they're all looking at what's going to open up and they don't know what's coming at them, but they're saying, whatever you see, we got to stay together. And situational awareness, George, is what you're talking about. And as you were saying that, I said, gee, that's not only important for our families. I was going to ask you, is there any way you can get that message to Congress and the president? Situational awareness, because there's so much coming at us, and it's almost as if there's that some people on Capitol Hill and even in the White House are tone deaf to how we might be aware of situations and be prepared for the onslaught of these unexpected disruptions of our lives. COVID-19, racism, political division, the economic downturn that we're experiencing right now, which is really, really plummeting. Yet our spirit should not plummet. We should be able to stand together in our households and outside of our house to make sure that this country runs effectively.
Yes, so true. One of my favorite quotes is that life is 10% of what happens to you and 90% of how you respond to what happens to you. So each morning we have a choice on how we're going to respond to the things that are thrown at us. And how we want, we have to focus on those things that are within our control, and then we have to adjust to those things that are outside of our control. And attitude is everything. It's what shapes our beliefs. It shapes our desires, and those things determine our actions. So Matthew 7:24-27, it doesn't say if the storm will come, it says when the storms will come. So they're going to be coming, and we've got to be ready to react in a way that aligns with our beliefs and our values, and not let that be determined by the storms that are raging in our country.
Wow.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think so many times, again, we think the storm will not come, but if we practice every day like we know the storm could come, then we'll be ready for in those times to do what we need to do. Hey, Kelly, one more quick point, and I know we got to run, but another major point that we like to bring up during times of uncertainty uncertainty is that we have to make sure that we're on the right team, right? And that's kind of checking in with each other every day. Being on the right team helps us to know a lot of things. And your team, whoever's listening today, your team has to be not just you and your spouse and you and your family, but for us as believers, we say the first line of defense is you and God, right? And then it's you and your family. And then we call it you and your coach. We all need a coach. We all need somebody in business. We all need mentorship in our marriage, or how to be better fathers or our husbands. And so you got to get a coach, someone who knows a little bit more than you, who's been in the game a little bit longer than you, and probably a little bit more successful at this life than you. And then lastly, we say you and your people. That's who are you doing life with? We can't be lone rangers. We've got to open our life up to others so that they can help us on our journey.
That's awesome. George and Tanu Gregory, I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for that, on how we navigate through this season of uncertainty. We don't know how long it's going to last, but we sure know that if we are tough-minded in our faith, we can get through this. Thank you.
Amen.
All right.
Have a great weekend, guys.
You too.
All right,
Take
God
care.
bless.
God bless.
We'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. And now for my final word. As we look back on what's taken place this week, where we all said farewell to Congressman John Lewis, it's important for us to understand one thing. We must continue to speak out against that which is wrong and keep on pushing for good trouble. Hopefully, we've been righted, ignited, and united to keep spreading not hate, not fear, but love, freedom, and peace. Good night.
Come on, all aboard.
Let me break it down for you like this.
The rhythm of love is easy to find if you're listening. The color of light isn't red, black, or white, but it's crimson. We all bleed the same. If you don't feel the groove, it's alright. Just give it time, give it time. Come on, y'all. Get on board. Mankind won't survive if our hearts beat inside a hateful rhythm. You see, love isn't bought, but comes with a price of forgiveness, and we all bleed the same. Yeah. If you don't feel it now, just wait. It's coming on, the love train. Just give it time, give it time. Get on board. That means you and you and you. Get on board.